Hi there, everybody. This Vodcast is focused on autism spectrum disorder. So we are going to talk about autism spectrum within the context of normative development, as we will with the other disorders that we discuss in the course. So I just want to mention three typical strength areas for children, and these also become some areas where we see deficits in children who have autism. So social cognition. Social cognition is the process of, is our ability to process social and emotional events. We are very interested in what's going on around us. We are inherently social beings. Children can easily and readily identify what's most important in a scene when they're in some sort of social setting. And so if there's a lot going on around them, there's walls, there's carpet, there's food, but they're drawn to people generally. They're drawn to the facial expressions of people and to that social interaction. So they hone in on people's responses, their facial expressions, what they're saying and doing. We're very good at social learning, as you know. I know you know that term, the idea that we learn by watching other people in this inherent social environment that we grow up in. We're very good at processing faces, readily identifying without any verbal information what someone's emotional state is and processing their facial expression. And we're very good at learning from other people. Again, that's that social learning link, and also about other people by watching their nonverbal behavior and their verbal behavior to be able to draw some conclusions about how they're feeling, what they're doing, what they're thinking. This relates closely to the idea of theory of mind. Theory of mind emerges beginning in infancy, research shows, and then it also develops late into childhood as well. So it's still developing, at 12, 13 years old. Theory of mind is defined as the ability to recognize one's own and others' mental states. Okay, recognize one's own and others' mental states. By mental states, we mean things like emotions, beliefs, perceptions, intentions, goals, right? So this involves your ability to be aware of your own mental states. I'm feeling sad right now, or it's my intention to do such and such, or I feel stressed, let me reflect on why I'm feeling stressed. But also to be able to do that with other people. In other words, to read people, right? So when you can read other people, you can take their perspectives. You can say, oh, that person is going through a difficult time. They must be very distressed. They must feel very sad. They must be very afraid. And we don't know that necessarily because they tell us those things. We're able to just read them through their facial expressions, through their behaviors, just knowing a little bit about the experiences that they've had. We're able to recognize what's probably going on in their mind or in their emotional state. This is essential for successful social interactions, because not only do we read these other people's mental states and also reflect on our own mental states, we use our judgments about people's beliefs, intentions, emotions. We use that information and we interpret it so that then we act appropriately in social interactions. So if we read someone and their body language is telling us that they are very angry, then that affects the way that we would approach them. Maybe we would decide not to approach them at that moment, right? So it's not just that we recognize the mental states, we also interpret them, and that ends up impacting our behavior and the way that we interact socially. So critically important for successful social interactions. Related to this, kind of within the realm of social cognition and theory of mind, is a concept known as joint attention. So joint attention emerges early, 9 to 14 months of age, and this is when you are able to make a social connection with another person by directing that person's attention to an object by showing or looking. So picture a 9, 10, 11, 12-month-old, and they might go woof woof, right? And they point off in the distance to a dog. And when they're pointing off and going woof woof, they're trying to get your attention. So they're looking at you, they're pointing woof woof, and if you're not responding, they might get louder and they adjust their reactions. All right? So that's a very important skill that sort of draws people close to you, right? Because you try to engage them and bring them into what you're paying attention to, hence joint attention. Affective social competence relates to emotional states, emotional expressions, and it's very closely tied to theory of mind, but focusing specifically on the emotions. So affective social competence means that you have an ability to use emotional information, your own and others, to have successful social interactions. So that, see, I can just chuck this. Woo! That sets the stage for understanding the deficits that we see in children who have autism spectrum disorder. So autism is one of the areas of the DSM-5 that reflects really updated classification. As we've mentioned before, Asperger's syndrome is no longer a separate diagnosis. Pervasive developmental disorder, otherwise not specified, is also no longer a diagnosis. So all of those former diagnoses would now fold into autism spectrum disorder. So I'm just briefly going to go through the diagnostic criteria. A, there needs to be deficits in social communication and social interaction. So think of the concepts we just reviewed, deficits in those kinds of areas. And that shows up in 3 different ways. All of these ways should be present. So no social emotional reciprocity. So this can play out in things like not knowing instinctually how to take conversational turns, right? Human beings, typically developing human beings, are good at this. We have an instinct. I'm going to say something, I'm going to wait, you're going to say something, I'm going to ask an appropriate follow-up question, and we're going to take some conversational turns. That's just one example. Also, a lack of initiating social interactions when they would be appropriate, when you might greet someone at the door, for example, or say goodbye before you leave a party. And not responding appropriately to social interactions when people initiate with you. Also, social approach is abnormal. So this means things like how do you approach a new social interaction. So something like a greeting, it's awkward or it's abnormal or it's completely absent. Next, deficits in nonverbal communication. So lack of facial expressions or inappropriate or abnormal facial expressions, avoiding eye contact, averting gaze. The person might not understand gestures and nonverbal behavior that other people show, and they may not initiate their own use of gestures. Deficits in developing, maintaining, and understanding relationships and adjusting behavior to suit the social context, right? So you adjust your behavior all the time based on the social setting that you are in. This is an area of deficit for children with autism. And also they have trouble cultivating and maintaining and sustaining their relationships. So that affects their interactions with their peers. They often show a lack of interest in socializing with their peers, and they often have difficulties initiating and maintaining friendships. So then the second area, the B criteria, so we need to see that A list for a diagnosis, and then we need to see something in this B list here. Restrictive, repetitive patterns of behavior, interests, or activities as manifested by at least 2 of the following. So in the previous, in A, we needed all of those, so here we need at least 2 out of the 4. 1, stereotyped or repetitive motor movements, use of objects, or speech. So repetitive motor movements could be flapping of the arms, for example, wringing the hands. It could be banging the head or other self-injurious behaviors. Could be pencil tapping or echolalia, repeating speech, saying the same thing over and over again. But it's like you're stuck in a rut doing the same thing over and over. 2, insistence on sameness, routines, ritualized patterns of verbal or nonverbal behavior. So in this case, wanting the daily routine to go exactly the same, and there can be a lot of acting out and meltdowns if the routine is deviated for any particular reason, whether it's a sleeping routine, a feeding routine, the getting ready in the morning routine. So strong sense of ritualization and a need for that sameness. Not very adaptive to changes in the routine. 3, restricted, fixated interests that are abnormal in intensity or focus. So this can be something like delving very deeply into dinosaurs, fixating on dinosaurs or trains. A good example in the book that highlights this idea of an abnormal focus area would be that maybe the child is very interested in Matchbox cars, but what they're interested in is just spinning the wheels, not the actual car, and not having the cars drive, turning the car over and spinning the wheels. So the dinosaur or train example could be this fixated interest that's abnormal in intensity. But in terms of abnormality and focus, think of that car example, focusing on the wheels. 4, hyper or hyporeactivity to sensory input or unusual interest in sensory aspects of the environment. So for example, maybe indifferent to pain sensations. They may not notice stark changes in temperature, excessive smelling or touching of objects or people or hair. Adverse reactions to sounds and textures, things like alarms, wool clothing, tags in clothes, having very strong reactions to things that are not pleasant for them. So this is this B section here, and the C criteria, these symptoms must be present in early development, so usually we're seeing these symptoms by 2 years old, certainly. And D, all of these symptoms should come together and create significant impairment in a variety of areas of functioning, things like cognitive functioning, social and emotional functioning. All right. In the DSM, there is also, when you're doing the diagnostic criteria, you also specify the severity level. This reflects what we've talked about in terms of dimensional conceptions of disorders and psychopathology. So on this dimensional approach, that is the emphasis of the DSM-5, it sort of replaced the categorical approach. That's why you're not seeing Asperger's as sort of this high-functioning autism and a separate criteria. That would be more of a categorical model. What you're seeing is looking at levels of severity and folding everything in under the umbrella of autism. So the classification goes like this. A severity of 3 means that this impairment requires very substantial support. 2 requires substantial support. 1 requires some support. And you would indicate the severity level for the A and the B categories, the social communication and the restricted repetitive behavior. So this allows you to say that someone is a level 1 severity for A and a level 3 for B, for example. You would also specify if this child has a diagnosis with or without intellectual impairments, with or without language impairments. Notice we didn't talk a lot about verbal language. We talked more about nonverbal, so that would be sort of an add-on specification. If verbal language is affected. Is it associated with a known medical or genetic condition, like a chromosomal abnormality? And is it associated with some other mental disorder? You would indicate that as well in the diagnosis according to DSM-5.